Since we last spoke, one of the things that happened is we've had an election in Israel, and we now have Benjamin Netanyahu, for a record 5th term now, elected. He said some things during that campaign that could give pause to international forces, such as what will go on with the Golan Heights and possible annexation of the settlements. If he sticks to that, what will that mean for the region?
Well, it's basically moving away from any prospects for a peace between Israel and certainly the Palestinians. I think these unilateral acts are contrary to international law. The international community recognizes the principled position of the non-acquisition of territory by force, and the Geneva Conventions have all sorts of rules and a framework for what an occupying power can do and not do in occupied territories. So these are very, really important political moves on the part of Israel and also on the part of the Trump administration in recognizing both Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the embassy there. That was one major move by the Trump administration. The other, giving cognizance to Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, cutting off aid to the Palestinians. So this is a complex of decisions being made both in Washington and Jerusalem that I believe are distancing the prospects of peace.
From your knowledge of Israel and the region more generally, which is very deep, would another Prime Minister of Israel have gone forward to say at least the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu has said without at least the tacit approval of the United States government? In the past, the United States government has really tried to rein in the Israeli government on some of these more extreme actions.
Well, previous American administrations have taken a position that support the fundamental approach toward Arab-Israeli peace. People in Washington and the administration say that, well, everything else has failed, and we're going to start something new. We don't know what that new is because the Trump administration has now been in office for 2 years. And we've heard about the deal of the century, but nobody really knows outside of a very small group what that deal actually is. So it's very difficult to hypothesize as to what the administration is planning. Having said that, let's set the record straight. Many efforts in past administrations since 1967 have failed to bring about Israeli-Palestinian peace. But let's not forget that Jimmy Carter brokered the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty in '79 based on the principle of land for peace. We constructed the Madrid Peace Conference under President Bush 41 and Secretary Baker under the principled position of land for peace, which led in 1994 to the second Israeli peace treaty with a neighboring state, with Jordan. And so it hasn't been a total failure, as some administration spokesmen say. Any approach toward Israeli-Palestinian peace must be based on the principle of land for peace that is emboldened and is written in UN Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. What I'm concerned about, and I, like most outsiders, have no knowledge of exactly what the deal of the century contains, is that any American approach that is not based on the principle of land for peace, a territorial settlement based on the 67 lines, the Palestinian refugee issue being taken into consideration, and there are various ways of dealing with that issue in terms of rehabilitation, reconstruction, resettlement of refugees, and Jerusalem as the capital of both a future Palestinian state and, of course, Israel's capital, and security and economic arrangements. These have been the basic parameters for any structural approach toward Arab-Israeli peace, and especially Israeli-Palestinian peace. I don't think an economic peace based on economic incentives or a security peace based on security arrangements alone outside of a political context based on these principles is simply going to work.
One of the most important relations that Israel has had in the Middle East for some years now has been with Egypt, a peace treaty with Egypt that has really prevailed through some very difficult times. We had the so-called Arab Spring come, and there were two really changes in regime down in Egypt with Mr. Sisi now in charge. We talked earlier today, we at Bloomberg talked with the Egyptian Minister of Investment about exactly what is left and whether we're really past that Arab Spring. This is what she had to say.
President Sisi has put a grand vision for Egypt in terms of moving forward with a very bold and courageous economic reform program that has been packaged by conditional cash transfer and a lot of social safety nets.
So, Mr. Ambassador, has President Sisi moved us past the aftermath of the Arab Spring?
Every Arab leader, ever since the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings of 2011, 2012, have been very painfully sensitized to the incredibly important need to make forward movement on socioeconomic reforms in their countries. The greatest threat to all these regimes comes from within. The inability of the regimes in power in the Arab world to address the fundamental needs of their people. So economic reforms are critical. Economic reforms have been tried in the past and have not succeeded very well in various countries. So President Sisi is now embarked on a new set of reforms. We just simply have to see how effective they are and how much political will is behind these reforms. But there's no questioning that at the time of the Arab uprising, I called it the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring. I said this is a tectonic shift in the political landscape of the Arab world, because it was spontaneous. People, especially youth, demonstrated in the streets with slogans like enough. We've had enough of a lack of political participation, enough of systemic corruption in these regimes, enough of high youth unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, as we've seen in many so-called spontaneous revolutions or uprisings, the aftermath has been the reestablishment of the status quo. That status quo has to be changed. So these leaders, like Sisi, are compelled and must try instituting socioeconomic reforms.
Well, it's fascinating, Mr. Ambassador, because it's just what I was thinking as I was listening to you. There was an uprising for more political participation. I wonder if you think there's more political participation in Egypt today than there was before. Look, for that matter, at Saudi Arabia, where we have Mohammed bin Salman, who also is implementing economic reform, but is there more political participation?
I see what you're seeing in the Arab countries and regimes is the emphasis and the focus is on economic and some social reforms, but not political reform. I don't think any of these regimes are really committed to structural political reforms and what I call, let's not even use the word democratization, but let's use the word broadening political participation in their societies, free elections. I don't see that happening. Tunisia is a glimmer of hope, has been a glimmer of hope, because you had in Tunisia, where the Arab Spring began, let us not forget, you had an Islamist party come to power, and when the vote went against the party, they left power peacefully. Now, the situation is still not very stable, but at least that was a glimmer of what should be happening in the Arab world and the Middle East as a whole. But political participation, the broadening of political participation, I don't think is the primary focus of the current regimes in the Arab world, but economic, social reforms is something they're compelled to do.
So, Mr. Ambassador, throughout your long and very distinguished career in the diplomatic corps, I think it was a spoken premise of the United States foreign policy that, in fact, you needed ultimately to get to political reform. Maybe sometimes our actions didn't comport with that, but basically, ultimately, for stability within a country, you needed political reform. As we look around the world, it's not just in the Middle East now. Take a look at China, for example. They've had a lot of economic reform, a lot of economic progress. I'm not sure we'd say there's been a lot of political reform. Is there a different model, a different paradigm coming to the fore that really is in competition with what the United States has historically put forward?
Yes, I think it's let's call it authoritarian stability. In other words, you maintain the political system in place, which is what we as Americans would not consider to be truly democratic systems like we have here and in Europe and in other countries in the world, but more an authoritarian model of dictating what the economy should be. China is a very special case of a communist party, which is an authoritarian political structure that ever since Deng Xiaoping has been moving forward on a private entrepreneurship and private capital sector. But there's a tension. There's always a tension between private economic structures and enterprise and authoritarian government. Mm-hmm. As we know in the United States and in Europe, the best model is the marriage between a democratic form of government and private entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. And private capital systems, because that promotes innovation and economic growth.